Hi, I'm Rashonda Cade. This is Reading with Rashonda. We are reading Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. We are on chapter 5. We'll probably get through the whole thing, but if we don't, we don't. That's okay. So, chapter 5, My Introduction to Mrs. Lincoln. Ever since arriving in Washington, I had a great desire to work for the ladies of the White House, and to accomplish this, I was ready to make almost any sacrifice consistent with propriety. I love that. She's like, I'm not going to do everything, but if it's proper, I'll do it. Excuse me. Work came in slowly, and I was beginning to feel very much embarrassed, for I did not know how I was to meet the bills staring me in the face. It is true the bills were small, but then they were formidable to me, who had little or nothing to pay them with. While in this situation, I called at the Ringolds, where I met Mrs. Captain Lee. Mrs. L was in a state bordering on excitement, as the great event of the season, the dinner party given in honor of the Prince of Wales, was soon to come off, and she must have a dress suitable for the occasion. The silk had been purchased, but a dressmaker had not yet been found. Miss Ringgold recommended me, and I received the order to make the dress. When I called on Mrs. Lee the next day, her husband was in the room and handing me a roll of bank bills amounting to $100. He requested me to purchase the trimmings and to spare no expense in making a selection. With the money in my pocket, I went out into the street, entered the store of Harper and Mitchell, and asked to look at their laces. Mr. Harper waited on me himself, and he was polite and kind. When I asked permission to carry the laces to Mrs. Lee in order to learn whether she could approve my selection or not, he gave a ready assent. When I reminded him that I was a stranger and that the goods were valuable, he remarked that he was not afraid to trust me, that he believed my face was the index to an honest heart. It was pleasant to be spoken to thus, and I shall never forget the kind words of Mr. Harper. I often recall them, for they are associated with the dawn of a brighter period in my dark life. I purchased the trimmings, and Mr. Harper allowed me a commission of $25 on the purchase. The dress was done in time, and it gave complete satisfaction. Mrs. Lee attracted great attention at the dinner party, and her elegant dress proved a good card for me. I received numerous orders and was relieved from all pecuniary embarrassment. One of my patrons was Mrs. General McLean, a daughter of General Sumner. One day when I was very busy, Mrs. McC drove up to my apartments, came in where I was engaged with my needle, and in her emphatic way said, Lizzie, I am invited to dine at Willard's on next Sunday, and I positively have not a dress fit to wear on the occasion. I have just purchased material, and you must commence work on it right away. But Mrs. McLean, I replied, I have more work now promised than I can do. It is impossible for me to make a dress for you to wear on Sunday next. Pshaw, nothing is impossible. I must have the dress made by Sunday, and she spoke with some impatience. I am sorry, I began, but she interrupted me. Now, don't say no again. I tell you that you must make the dress. I have often heard you say that you would like to work for the ladies of the White House. Well, I have it in my power to obtain you this privilege. I know Mrs. Lincoln well, and you shall make a dress for her provided you finish mine in time to wear at dinner on Sunday. Well, people like that infuriate me. But would I have made the dress? Probably, and then I also would have been mad at myself for breaking my own boundaries. Let's see what she does. The inducement was the best that could have been offered. She's going to make the dress. I would undertake the dress if I should have to sit up all night, every night, to make my pledge good. I sent out and employed assistants, and after much worry and trouble, the dress was completed to the satisfaction of Mrs. McLean. I hope she charged her extra, because doing stuff fast costs you more. It appears that Mrs. Lincoln had upset a cup of coffee on the dress she designed wearing on the evening of the reception after the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln as President of the United States, which rendered it necessary that she should have a new one for the occasion. On asking Mrs. McLean who her dressmaker was, the lady promptly informed her, Lizzie Keckley. Lizzie Keckley? The name is familiar to me. She used to work for some of my lady friends in St. Louis, and they spoke well of her. Can you recommend her to me? With confidence. Shall I send her to you? If you please. I shall feel under many obligations for your kindness. The next Sunday, Mrs. McLean sent me a message to call at her house at 4 o'clock p.m. that day. As she did not state why I was to call, I determined to wait till Monday morning. Monday morning came, and 9 o'clock found me at Mrs. McCee's house, the streets of the capital. So she's like, I will work for you extra hard if you give me extra money, but if you just tell me to come to your house on a Sunday and not tell me why, I'm not gonna. I'm gonna wait till Monday and during business hours. The streets of the capital were thronged with people, for this was Inauguration Day. A new president, a man of the people from the broad prairies of the West, was to accept the solemn oath of office, was to assume the responsibilities attached to the high position of Chief Magistrate of the United States. Chief Magistrate? Hmm. Never was such deep interest felt in the inauguration proceedings as was felt today, for threats of assassination had been made, and every breeze from the south came heavily laden with the rumors of war. Around Willard's Hotel swayed an excited crowd, and it was with the utmost difficulty that I worked my way to the home on the opposite side of the street, occupied by the McLeans. Mrs. McLean was out, but presently an aide on General McLean's staff called and informed me that I was wanted at Willard's. I crossed the street and on entering the hotel was met by Mrs. McLean, who greeted me. Lizzie, why did you not come yesterday as I requested? Mrs. Lincoln wanted to see you, but I fear that now you are too late. I am sorry, Mrs. McLean. You did not say what you wanted with me yesterday, so I judged that this morning would do as well. You should have come yesterday, she insisted. Go up to Mrs. Lincoln's room, giving me the number. She may find use for you yet. I get both sides. Like, don't you're especially have I've not been a slave, but Elizabeth Keckley, especially having been a slave, you don't just get to tell me to show up at your house and not tell me why and expect me to just be there. I get not just showing up. But from Mrs. McLean's point of view, she's like, I'm trying to do you a favor. Why did you not come when I asked you to come? All right, let's keep reading. With a nervous step, I passed on and knocked at Mrs. Lincoln's door. A cheery voice bade me come in, and a lady, inclined to stoutness, about 40 years of age, stood before me. You are Lizzie Keckley, I believe. I bowed assent. The dressmaker that Mrs. McLean recommended? Yes, madam. Very well. I have not time to talk to you now, but would like to have you call at the White House at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, where I shall then be. I bowed myself out of the room and returned to my apartments. The day passed slowly, for I could not help but speculate in relation to the appointed interview for the morrow. My long cherished hope was about to be realized, and I could not rest. Tuesday morning, at 8 o'clock, I crossed the threshold of the White House for the first time. I wonder what it was like just waltzing into the White House. Do, 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 do. I was shown into a waiting room and informed that Mrs. Lincoln was at breakfast. In the waiting room, I found no less than 3 mantua makers. I do not know what a mantua is, nor do I know what a mantua maker is. But they were apparently waiting for interviews. In the waiting room, I found no less than 3 mantua makers waiting for an interview with the wife of the new president. It seems that Mrs. Lincoln had told several of her lady friends that she had urgent need for a dressmaker, and that each of these friends had sent her mantua maker to the White House. Okay, a mantua maker is a dressmaker. Good to know. Hope fell at once. With so many rivals for the position sought after, I regarded my chances for success as extremely doubtful. You got to bet on yourself, ma'am. I was the last one summoned to Mrs. Lincoln's presence. All the others had a hearing and were dismissed. I went upstairs timidly, and entering the room with nervous step, discovered the wife of the president standing by a window, looking out, and engaged in lively conversation with a lady, Mrs. Grimsley, as I afterwards learned. Mrs. L. came forward and greeted me warmly. You have come at last. Mrs. Keckley, who have you worked for in this city? Among others, Mrs. Senator Davis has been one of my best patrons, was my reply. Mrs. Davis? So you have worked for her, have you? Of course you gave satisfaction. So far, good. Can you do my work? Yes, Mrs. Lincoln. Will you have much work for me to do? That, Mrs. Keckley, will depend altogether upon your prices. I trust that your terms are reasonable. I cannot afford to be extravagant. We are just from the West and are poor. If you do not charge too much, I shall be able to give you all my work. I get that. My guess is they weren't exactly poor, but being a president was super expensive back in this day. They paid for the parties and all the things. Like you had to be rich to be president, to at least be president in a way that other people would approve of. And as I learned while the Obamas were in office, the family still has to pay for any number of things that I totally thought taxpayers were paying for. Okay, so we'll keep going. I do not think there will be any difficulty about charges, Mrs. Lincoln. My terms are reasonable. Well, if you will work cheap, you shall have plenty to do. I can't afford to pay big prices, so I frankly tell you so in the beginning. The terms were satisfactorily arranged, and I measured Mrs. Lincoln, took the dress with me, a bright rose-colored moire antique, and returned the next day to fit it on her. A number of ladies were in the room, all making preparations for the levee to come off on Friday night. Just a few more pages. These ladies, I learned, were relatives of Mrs. L. Mrs. Edwards and Mrs. Kellogg, her own sisters, and Elizabeth Edwards and Julia Baker, her nieces. Mrs. Lincoln this morning was dressed in a cashmere wrapper quilted down the front, and she wore a simple headdress. The other ladies wore mourning robes. I was hard at work on the dress when I was informed that the levee had been postponed from Friday night till Tuesday night. This, of course, gave me more time to complete my task. Mrs. Lincoln sent for me and suggested some alteration in style, which was made. She also requested that I make a waist of blue watered silk for Mrs. Grimsley, as work on the dress would not require all my time. Okay, true, but does she have other clients? Like, are you hiring her to be your exclusive mantua maker? Or are you hiring her for piecework to make a dress for you here and there and you're paying her by the piece? Because that makes a difference. Um, what she does in her time, she's not for you, is none of your business if you haven't hired her with the expectation of exclusivity. Let's keep reading. Tuesday evening came, and I had taken the last stitches on the dress. I folded it and carried it to the White House with the waist for Mrs. Grimsley. When I went upstairs, I found the ladies in a terrible state of excitement. Mrs. Lincoln was protesting that she could not go down for the reason that she had nothing to wear. Mrs. Keckley, you have disappointed me, deceived me. Why do you bring my dress at this late hour? Because I have just finished it and I thought I should be in time. But you are not in time, Mrs. Keckley. You have bitterly disappointed me. I have no time now to dress, and what is more, I will not dress and go downstairs. I am sorry if I have disappointed you, Mrs. Lincoln, for I intended to be in time. Will you let me dress you? I can have you ready in a few minutes. No, I won't be dressed. I will stay in my room. Mr. Lincoln can go down with the other ladies. But there is plenty of time for you to dress, Mary, joined in Mrs. Grimsley and Mrs. Edwards. Let Mrs. Keckley assist you, and she will soon have you ready. Like, what? I mean, I don't know how soon before the party it was, but come on, and you're the one who told her to work on the waist for the other person. Let's keep reading. Thus urged, she consented. I dressed her hair. You dressed her hair too? Oh, shucks. I dressed her hair and arranged the dress on her. It fitted nicely, and she was pleased. Mr. Lincoln came in, threw himself on the sofa, laughed with Willie and little Tad, and then commenced pulling on his gloves, quoting poetry all the while. You seem to be in a poetical mood tonight, said his wife. Yes, mother, these are poetical times, was his pleasant reply. I declare you look charming in that dress. Mrs. Keckley has met with great success. And then he proceeded to compliment the other ladies. Mrs. Lincoln looked elegant in her rose-colored moire antique. She wore a pearl necklace, pearl earrings, pearl bracelets, and red roses in her hair. Mrs. Baker was dressed in lemon-colored silk, Mrs. Kellogg in a drab silk, ashes of rose, Mrs. Edwards in a brown and black silk, Miss Edwards in crimson, and Mrs. Grimsley in blue watered silk. Just before starting downstairs, Mrs. Lincoln's lace handkerchief was the object of search. It had been displaced by Tad, who was mischievous and hard to restrain. The handkerchief found, all became serene. Mrs. Lincoln took the president's arm and with smiling face led the train below. I was surprised at her grace and composure. I had heard so much in current and malicious report of her low life, of her ignorance and vulgarity, that I expected to see her embarrassed on this occasion, and I guess she had seen some of her low life, as she put it just a minute ago when she threw the fit. Report, I soon saw, was wrong. No queen, accustomed to the usages of royalty all her life, could have comported herself with more calmness and dignity than did the wife of the president. She was confident and self possessed, and confidence always gives grace. Ooh, I love that. Confidence always gives grace. That's a quote I might write down from my friend Elizabeth Keckley. This levee was a brilliant one, and the only one of the season. I became the regular modiste as Mrs. Lincoln. I made 15 or 16 dresses for her during the spring and early part of the summer when she left Washington, spending the hot weather at Saratoga, Long Branch, and other places. In the meantime, I was employed by Mrs. Senator Douglas, one of the loveliest ladies that I ever met, Mrs. Secretary Wells, Mrs. Secretary Stanton, and others. Mrs. Douglas always dressed in deep mourning with excellent taste, and several of the leading ladies of Washington society were extremely jealous of her superior attraction. That ends chapter 5 of Behind the Scenes by Elizabeth Keckley. I'm Rashonda Cade, and this is Reading with Rashonda. Until next time.